Now let's move to the second person that we want to discuss today. Well, second question, really, and then the second author that we want to discuss. Now, this question asks us, what kinds of settlements were in the Philippines and what was their internal structure? So, alam na natin kung paano nag-emerge yung communities na yun, di ba? Through Younker's arguments. Raiding, trading, feasting, right? But in this question, we're asking, okay, so what kinds of actual settlements emerged and what were their internal structures? So, here we find, quite useful to our question, the answers from William Henry Scott. So, William Henry Scott was a prolific scholar. Like, he has potentially hundreds of small articles and books to his name. And he did a lot of foundational work for pre-colonial and unhispanized histories in the 50s to 70s. So his work details class structure for different pre-colonial settlements, as well as the ways other societies that evaded direct Spanish rule would continue to develop. Now, here is an excerpt from his book Barangay, where he describes, where he got the term barangay. Here is a preview into his table of context, table of contents, and how wide the information he was able to glean from the parchment curtain were, diba? So ito yung mga nahanap niya. Now, we can't go through these today, but what we can do is look at the classes of societies that Scott identifies. Now, this is already kind of modified, no? Because we're only covering the settlements that emerge in the pre-Hispanic period. Now, if we only look at those settlements, then we have classless societies, warrior societies, and lowland coastal settlements. Now, inalis natin yung principalities kasi yun nga yung discussion natin sa Module 5, diba? Sultanates. Okay, so you probably have encountered this in History 1, but what we're going to do now is just briefly go through each of them as a form of review. Now, the most simple forms of societies, you could see these are the Fs in Younker's dendritic trade, yung mga talagang upland groups, no? Usually have minimal leadership rules. So they're egalitarian or flat societies, which usually have no terms to distinguish one social class from another. So in terms of socio-political complexity, where internal differentiation is an important marker of development, these societies are less developed. No, we're not saying worse. What we're saying is less developed in the sense that they have less roles in their communities. So leaders, in fact, would only really emerge in times of warfare, economic need, or alliance building. So, warfare, economic needs, such as, if they have to move from one place to another to find sustenance, yeah, they need to forage in another area, for instance. Or if they have to create allies for the other places for the purposes of trade, then a leader would emerge. Now, their basis of economy tended to be subsistence, meaning what they plant and what they forage is enough only for their own consumption. So they can't really trade widely with other areas unless they collect special goods from the forests that they live in. Examples in later times of classless societies would be the Hanunoo, Mangyan, Tagbanwa, and the Aita. But of course, this is for earlier periods of time. Now, in the present, these people have different forms of class differentiation already. Okay, here's an early depiction from the Boxer Codex of the Negrillos, or the Aitas, who were a classless society when the Spanish arrived in the Philippines. The next form of society are warrior societies, where a leader is chosen based on their achievements in warfare. So you can tell then that classes distinguished by prowess in battle or their ability to fight, defend, and attack. Now, there are names for warrior classes in different parts of the Philippines, which shows us that, they're present in different spaces, even if these spaces are very far away from each other. So, for the Manobo, Mandaya, Bagobo, Tagakaulo, and Balaan, the term is usually Bagani or Magani, and these are places you find in Mindanao. The Isneg and Kalingas at some point have called these warrior classes the Mengal or Maingal or Braves, diba? These words may mean different things in the present. For instance, Bagani sounds like bayani or hero, right? And in our present understanding of hero, you don't exactly need to be good in battle to become a hero. So you can see through time, these words have evolved to contain different meanings. But during this time, the early colonial or pre-colonial period, to be a bagani or a magani means to be a warrior. Now, their basis of economy and examples, of course, include raiding, trading, and agriculture. Here's an example of an early depiction of a warrior society, which we find in the Boxer Codex. This wasn't edited at all. They just kind of cut it out and then they placed it in a calendar under the NHCP. Pero this is a depiction of the painted people or pintados. It's a Spanish name, of course. But these are warring groups that the Spanish found in Visayas. Yeah. So we have other descriptions from Scott. No. And finally, the last kind of community we're going to study today. Now, lowland coastal or river settlements are interesting because they're usually warrior societies as well, which had a very strong trade aspect. No? So these would be the most encountered by the Spanish. For instance, they're the ones you find in Manila, and even along the Lalo, um, even in the Tajo or Cagayan River, di ba? So, along the Tahoe or Cagayan River, and even in Cebu. So, ito yung mga mas malalaking settlements na nahanap ng mga Espanyol dito. And they would become primary sites for Filipinization or reduction later on. Now, in these places, you find something very interesting. They have three estates, as Scott calls them, three estates or three classes of society, whether they are in Luzon or Visayas. This tends to be pretty consistent. They have a ruling class, a noble or warring class, and an alipin or indebted class. And their basis of economy is still trading, raiding, and even taxation. So they have, because they live in ports, they can tax the ships that come and try to trade with their area. Examples are the Moros of Manila when the Spanish arrived, the Bisaya in the ports of Oton and Cebu, and the Cagayanes in Lalo along the Tajo or Cagayan River in early points of contact. So here's an example of the people you find in these places. These are the naturales or natives, the Spanish would, or the Boxer Codex would say. These are the Moros of Luzon. The Boxer Codex explains that the natives around Manila Bay were at some point called Moros because they adopted some of the customs and followed the minor laws of Muhammad learned from Bornean traders. What made them distinct from the Moros was their language and belief in one supreme god called Bathala and in other deities. So it's not necessarily an Islamic society. It's a society that has taken a lot of beliefs and integrated them into their local understanding of spirituality. Okay, examples are the kingdoms of Maynila, Pasig, and Tondo. And these places, at least Tondo, is mentioned once again in the Laguna copper plate inscription. Right. Here are examples of lowland coastal settlements that would become important in the era of Spanish colonization. Yan. So, as alongside Hispanized place names such as San Juan, you also have places like Bawang, Kaba, Aringay, Agoo, which are, they're definitely local terms and they're local places or local communities that existed even before the Spanish reduced them into these settlements. Okay. So remember when we were talking about the noble or ruling class, the free class, and then the indebted class? Now, William Henry Scott tries to summarize the differentiations between class structure or internal hierarchy, diba? A key indicator of socio-political complexity between Luzon and Visayas. So in Luzon, you have the higher classes that are called the Maginoo. So this is where the highest class of rulers come from, and they're similar to nobles. In fact, Scott calls them hidalgo in his writings. And hidalgo is a Spanish word for noble. Ganun. So they're determined from bilateral lineage, meaning both your mother and your father's royal or noble status will matter in determining what you become. Now, another interesting ruling group would be the Maygintao. Or although they're not traditionally part of the noble class, they are wealthy individuals who sometimes compete for political power. So they could boost themselves to the level of leaders if they were savvy enough to do that. Now, under them, you have free classes in Luzon: the Timawa, or freemen who rendered service to a Panginoon through agricultural labor, and the Maharlika, who are freemen who render service to a Panginoon through military service. Both of these, the Timawa and Maharlika, had the right to ask for arbitration through customary law. So, ibig sabihin may legal rights sila to be protected. Now, the enslaved class in Luzon was usually differentiated between the aliping na mamahay, or householder slaves who owned their own property and had homes apart from their masters. They were not entitled to bring cases to customary court. So kung may utang ka, ganun kasi yun, di ba? Debt bondage are is a condition by which you borrow agricultural goods, for instance, like binhi. Tapos habang hindi mo pa nababalik, maaalipin ka sa isang amo. And usually these are your householder slaves. Now, the lower form of slaves are your aliping sa gigilid, known as hearth slaves, or those who are completely dependent on their master's household. They did not typically own property and could pass down their slave status to their children. Now, how about in Visayas? In Visayas, you still have the general noble or ruling classes, freemen, and then enslaved class, but we had different terms for this. Now, on the top level, you had the Datu class, which is both a social class and a political Datu. So, all of the people in the Datu class are bound to the Datu by an oath of allegiance or sanduguan. And then you have the Timawa, which is the warrior class. So they also kind of rule in a sense that they are the main supporters of the Datu. And they're very intimate with the Datu, no? They're not only comrades in arms and personal bodyguards, but they also test his wine for poison, and often they're blood related. They're his own relatives and his own natural sons. Now, among the ruling classes, there's a special category called binokot. And you can see how they're actually important in alliance building. So these are daughters of the Datus who had great political value as bridges for alliance building through marriage to other high ranking grooms. The princesses are binokot, or wrapped up to maintain their purity by social distancing. Now, social distancing means they're addressed in third person, they can't walk on the ground, binubuhat sila. Habang natutulog sila, dapat tahimik yung buong community. And they even have the observance of strict mourning taboos when they pass on. No? So it's as if the women themselves had become a form of prestige good, that when you had a binokot in your community, it was a symbol of a powerful political alliance with the family that the binokot was originally part of. Now, under them, you have the free classes. The free classes in Visayas, according to William Henry Scott, were called tumao. Now, these are the people without taint of slavery, servitude, or witchcraft. Members of this class were descendants of former datus, or of a foreign datus commanders, or even the relatives of prominent local rulers. This is where the current datus personal officers come from, such as the Atobang Sadatu, or Prime Minister, and the Sandig Sadatu, or supporters of the Datu. So you can kind of see that, say you're part of a Datu family and I'm part of a Datu family. Now, what happens is my Datu family dies off, like there's no heir, or through some kind of scramble for power, now you're in charge of the barangay or of the chiefdom. Now, in order to make sure my relatives don't attack you or don't rise up against that chiefdom, what you're gonna do is you're gonna make sure they remain in the tumao class without taint of slavery, servitude, or witchcraft. And so they were formerly nobles. And because you want to keep them loyal to you, what you do is you make them part of your leadership structure. You give them special roles. Not everyone, di ba? Pero yung mga formerly prominent people get special roles in your chiefdom just to make sure we don't rise up against you, right? And those are the tumao. Besides them, these are also people who are no longer enslaved. Okay. Now, below these, you have the oripon, which is the word for enslaved people in Visayas. Now, these are technically commoners who could not marry people of royal blood and who were under the obligation to serve and support the noble and warrior groups. Usual service rendered was agricultural labor. This was actually a very wide class that included commoners both with warrior potential, so they could actually win higher status like tumao through warfare. Like if, for example, you're indebted, you're a slave, you're an oripon, but because you're able to show you're valuable in battle, you might be forgiven of your debts and you might become a tumao. Right. So while the Oripon class could involve people like that, who could be quite valuable in society, it also includes slaves who were born into their masters' houses, and the lowest slaves who would be buried alive as tribute to dead masters. So there are so many different levels. Samples of this include the ayuoy, a domestic slave or bondsman whose offspring are the property of his master, or bihag, a captive, diba? Ginlubos, the child of two domestic slaves born into their master's house, or even Haishai, the child of a purchased or hereditary slave, Tuoy, a married ayuoy set up in housekeeping by his master. He normally becomes a tumaranpok when his children are old enough to replace him, which is two grades of servitude requiring specified kinds and periods of labor from both man and wife. The first is reckoned at twice the second in terms of debt or tribute if labor is commuted to payment in kind. Okay, confusing, diba? Pero basically, ang sinasabi nito ay, you can actually break free of slave status if the conditions for either rendering service or paying your debt in kind, meaning as binhi, seeds, or even as agricultural produce, could be given. So, pag nabigay mo na yun, pwedeng hindi ka na esclava or hindi ka na slave. Okay, so that's it for Scott. Now, what did we learn from Scott exactly? Now, if you think back, no, in Younker's narrative, we looked at how socio-politically complex communities or chiefdoms emerge, and what kinds of dynamics lead to that complexity, and also what kinds of relationships exist between lowland and upland settlements. For Scott, however, we delved into into those settlements and asked ourselves, ano nga ba yung itsura ng mga chiefdom nung mga panahon na iyon? And Scott says, well, Scott and Abenales and Amoroso say there are three kinds of settlements in this period, three kinds of chiefdoms, more or less. You have a classless society, which is not yet a chiefdom, could become a chiefdom, but was an early society that existed nonetheless. You have warrior societies that are definitely chiefdoms, and you have lowland coastal settlements, which are chiefdoms who have warrior roots, but also have who are pretty strong at trading with other communities. So when we looked at Scott, so that's the first thing that Scott showed us, the different kinds of settlements. He also showed us what forms of internal hierarchy existed in Luzon and in Visayas. So in Luzon, we have three classes that have subclasses, diba? So, okay, in general, there's a ruling or noble class, a free class, and an enslaved class. In Luzon, this looks like the Maginoo and the Magintao, who kind of compete for power. And then you have the Timawa and the Maharlika. And at the bottom, you have the Alibing. Now, in Visayas, this looks a little different. The ruling classes are called the Datu, but you also have a special class. Hold on, I forgot what the term was. Of the Timawa. So the Timawa are not freemen here, but they're like secondary supporters, or they're main supporters of the Datu class. You have special roles for women as trade tokens in this period. And then you have the free classes, the tumao. And then you have many, many different kinds of enslaved people, generally called oripon. Right? That's what you learn. So there are other items to learn from Scott as well, like specific details for different aspects of life, whether economic, spiritual, cultural, or even, like their drinking lives. And if you want to look into that further, there's a wealth of Scott's sources available online or even through our Open Athens subscriptions that you can look for.